mean, I overthink everything, which is part of the problem. But left to myself, um, I think that probably one of the thoughts I return to most is, what if nothing that I think is at all real? What if I'm just making stuff up in my head? And everybody can ask themselves that same question, from the most ardent atheist to the most fundamentalist Christian.
Pete, in your books, you deal with you deal with confronting this whole idea of a literalistic, biblicistic view of the Bible and undoing that. And this is a theme in your books. And for so many of us, especially those of us who are teaching the scriptures pretty consistently, this has been hugely helpful for us. Your academics, your scholarship, and just your plain common sense, great language. And you talk about a more open, more flexible view of that then supported by good history, good sensible history, very much accepted scholarship, while all remaining with a God of love. So, as you know, this is very far from our conservative Protestant American Western evangelical view. That has landed very far from that. So, my question is, as this whole shift is happening and growing, more people writing about it, talking about it, Pete, where do you think in the 21st century, where is Christianity, Christian spirituality, where is it going to end up with its Bible?
Darned if I know where.
Um,
But I do think the trends that I'm sensing, I'm sure all of you are sensing as well, I think will continue. I think people will be more upfront, be willing to be more public and upfront about questions they've had about just the nature of the Bible for a long time. And I think the more people talk, the more other people come out of the woodworks and talk. So I think what we're seeing now, whether it's deconstruction concerning the Bible or progressive, whatever we want to call it, I really don't care. It's more a willingness to re-examine fundamental questions, which are ones near and dear to my heart and to our heart at the Bible for Normal People, namely, what is the Bible really? And then what does it mean to read it well? And I do think that that's going to keep growing. I don't know if the mass majority of Christians in the West will be doing this. I think we'll continue having very different opinions on what's happening with the Bible. And I think it's fair, I mean, in my opinion, it's fair to think that polarization might be something that is going to continue for a while. If you're on social media at all and say anything about God, be ready. Somebody's going to shout at you with all caps and
yeah.
that kind of thing. So I don't think that's going to end, but I think that what we're seeing now, I think, will not decrease. I think it will increase. And what's needed is people in leadership, in my opinion, who understand that, who've lived it themselves, and can engage people who are looking for a different kind of relationship with the Bible.
Yeah. Do you think it's going to, do you think it's going to have a less than supernatural view? And what I mean is, those of us who used to hold an old literalistic, even though we understood it was written by humankind, sure, we got all of that. It still was something that was supernaturally written by God. That was, for a lot of us, an old understanding.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think for the Bible to stay relevant, where people are really grappling with it, it will have to lessen that kind of supernatural view towards it?
I would put it a little bit differently. Again, this is just my little opinion, but I think what I'd rather see is different kind of conversations about what it even means to think of the Bible as having the involvement of the creator of the multiverse.
Yeah.
You know, what does that even look like? And I think even though, evangelical theology is much more sophisticated on paper than we sometimes get the impression, but there are different ways of thinking about the nature of inspiration. And one of those models is something of a dictation, that God is actually, write this word and then a comma and then write that preposition, all that kind of stuff. And I think, the more you study the Bible, the harder it is to come away with that kind of a point of view.
Yeah.
You start seeing the anthropological dimensions of it. And I think that's very real. And in fact, I would go so far as to say that there is not a syllable of the Hebrew Bible and New Testament that cannot be explained on purely anthropological grounds.
Sure.
So where's God in all this? Well, that's the question. How do we talk about God as a part of that? And I'd like to think, if people be familiar with the book that got me fired, Inspiration and Incarnation, about 15, 20 years ago. And not fired, I got resigned. That's the official language. But if the incarnation, which, don't ask me to define that, to me that's itself a mystery, but if that God with us, however we define that, whatever it means, if that's part of the Christian faith, then I think we should be up to the task of seeing the full humanity of Scripture and how that can still be used by God. But that would drive us to very different notions of things like authority. Like, how is the Bible authoritative? Well, on the verse level, on the story level, on the theological sort of synthetic level of bringing, on the biblical theological level, those are all great questions that I think people who are trying to follow Jesus and who are so inclined to should be thinking about all the time anyway. Yeah. And they're not new questions, they're old questions. They've been answered in different ways. And I think it's our spiritual responsibility to address those questions in our time and in our generation.
So have you landed, or do you have an evolving view of what inspiration of the Bible means?
I sort of, yeah, and it definitely is evolving and changing, and I'm not at all bothered by that. That's just the way it is. And I think, if God is worth anything, God understands our humanity and how we struggle to put the pieces together. But for me, a notion of like God inspiring a text has to be sort of a subcategory of a larger issue, which is, the way it's often put by theologians, the God and world problem. How is God related to the world at all? And throwing in, things that might sound obscure, things I talked about in Curveball, like evolution or cosmology, that all affects how we understand the nature of God's relationship to the world, to the cosmos. And a text is one subset of that. And that's that would be the starting point for me to keep thinking about this sort of stuff. So if God is, if the presence of the Spirit is in everything and everyone, which I believe to be true, that's the kind of language I would like to try to bring into discussing the nature of Scripture itself. And that does move us from, let's say, black and white, either or sort of models of authority, listen to it or don't listen to it. No, it's discernment. It's wisdom, really. That's what we're trying to do with the Bible. And so to me, that's generally where I land. And that's probably not the most clear explanation all of you have ever heard. That's
no,
me. Welcome to my brain.
No, it's great. And let me come back to this word authority. When a lot of us were in conservative Protestantism, American Jesus evangelicalism, right, authority was authority of the Bible, the authority of God. Do you see Christian spirituality in the 21st century becoming a faith of wisdom? It's very much like the East, where it's about living wisely. Will Christian spirituality, will the Christian religion be a religion of wisdom, living
Mhm.
wisely. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, and I would say that welcome back, because this is not a new thing, right? And we sometimes think that it's new because of what we owe. Our inherited faith is very much steeped in modernity, in enlightenment and rationalism, all of which is great stuff, right? I mean, don't get me wrong, but it's also limited. It's Trip Fuller says, that sort of view has metaphysical limitations, if that's how you think about the nature of reality.
Right.
And so I think people are seeing a bigger picture here with respect to scripture and spirituality. And yeah, I think it's moving there now.
Yeah.
And of course, I'm sure it has many angles, many permutations. It's not just one thing to look at the Bible with wisdom and discernment. But I think that is, to me, a natural outgrowth of uh, really owning the humanity of this text and the diverse humanities of this text, is to use discernment. And as I never go tired of saying, I think, the Bible seems set up for that sort of thing because of its multivocality, right? It's just one, the biblical teaching on is a very perilous thing to enter, because you're going to have to be selective in the passages you use.
Yeah.
And that, to me, is, I would even say, that's inspired by God.
Yeah. Yeah.
We have a text where we can't use it as a rule book, and we have to think through it. And I think that's good news. And I think people feel it, if also a little bit frightened at the prospect, I think also feel the sort of liberation, the kind of anticipation people feel when it's like, oh crap, it's all changing. I sort of like it though. I think I might be able to sleep better at night. And to be able to really own the notion that the stressors that we feel about some of these shifts are not because of the nature of the shifts themselves, but it's where people start off and what they're coming from.
Yeah.
But I think people are seeing that, and social media, it's huge, for giving people space to think about things.
Yeah. And I agree with there's been liberation in viewing the Bible as multivocal versus one authoritative uh,
Mm-hmm.
voice. In fact, after 30 years in ministry, when someone would say, this is what it means, I'd go, I don't know if I can trust you. When someone said, you know what, I don't know what the hell it means, I go,
Yeah.
now that I can, now I can trust you. And
Yeah, we can
saying,
be
I
friends
don't,
now. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so a similar line of question, as we talked about the Bible, to overall Christian theology. And again, many of us are I grew up Catholic, but then converted to Protestantism in the whole the leftover Jesus movement into the 80s. But um, you know, since the Reformation, uh, and then really post Civil War, what became American evangelicalism. Um, I had mentioned in my question to you that I sent David Bebbington's
Sure. Yeah.
Quadrilateral,
Yeah.
the four essentials of what have defined conservative Protestantism or evangelicalism. Biblicism, of course, the Bible is authoritative. It is the supernatural, literal word of God. The crucifixion payment that salvation is found through Christ's death and his death and resurrection alone. Conversionism, the mandate of all Christians is to go share that view of the Bible, that view of salvation. And then activism, which for all the social justice people, they may go, yes, but in evangelicalism, not so quick. Activism has historically been a moral improvement of society
Yeah.
from
Yeah.
a
Mm-hmm.
Christian way.
Right.
So with that, Pete, as there has been a shift away from how the 20th century saw that, now a couple decades into the 21st century. Where is Christian spirituality, do you think, going to end on, you know, not just the Bible, but where are we on what is salvation to the Christian? What is Jesus' death or resurrection? Are we to convert? Like my best friend in town is a Jewish rabbi. I don't go to lunch with him and try to figure out how to share Isaiah with him and try to convert him to a messianic view of faith. So where do you think we're going to end up on all of this atonement?
I think more diversity
Yeah,
in opinions, which, also does reflect moments of the history of the church and even the New Testament itself in terms of what's going on with the cross anyway. And, I remember, David, a few years ago, I was sitting there reading, just minding, I didn't even know what I was reading, but I just sort of stopped reading. I looked out the window and I said to myself, I don't understand the cross at all. I don't understand the sense of it, especially the way it's usually portrayed as a necessary payment to maybe appease God's sense of justice or wrath because the justice has been, impinged upon. That may be a little bit of a caricature, but I think a lot of people, that's sort of where they're coming from. So,
yes.
I actually think, and I've thought about this a little bit. I think this specific question of the cross is going to become more and more fluid for people, and for good reason. And I think it's important to listen to the extent to which any biblical model of the purpose of the crucifixion has with it a cultural conditioning. And again, this is back to the point that everything can be explained anthropologically. It has a very ancient transactional view of what it means to be right with God. And I think the New Testament puts its own certain spins on those things, one of which is the vulnerability of God. God is participating somehow in this. It was just an odd thing. To me, that's something worth developing more. But for all the diversity in the New Testament, there's still some sort of transaction happening. And is that what God is like? Or is that how people understood God, inevitably understood God at a particular point in history? And of course, that gets into all sorts of things again, like we just talked about, like authority and whatnot. And how much does this change before it becomes unrecognizable to what's before? But I feel I don't have a choice but to say, okay, I don't know. I'm just one person. I'm not going to change the face of Christianity. I just want to try to understand this stuff. And there's one author I quote a couple of times in my last book in Curveball. Peter Todd is his name, and he talks about the need for a third millennium theology. And I think that's a really good way of putting it. We're in a very different era today and have been for the past 100 years or so. And there's a reason why things like process theology or, Tom Oord, open and relational theology, there's a reason why this stuff is around. It's basically to explain all that Christianity business within the context of what we know about physical reality,
Yeah.
an evolving universe, how long we've been here, how long the universe has been here, all that sort of stuff. And it's inevitable that we're going to see, I think, more and more changes. And I think a lot of people getting very nervous because of that, because they have an inherited faith that's still valuable to them. And I understand that. I'm not poo-pooing those people. I mean, we all have things like lines we won't cross. I think we all have something that just, I'm not going to go there. And some of us hit those lines earlier than others, but I think this is one that's going to rub out some lines eventually, and maybe encourage, like we're seeing today, an entrenchment in a certain fundamentalism.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. I think the idea of the cross, I as well been confused by, don't know where I'd land on, honestly, and think it will remain central. But I think a stout evangelical overhearing us would go, well, what are you talking about? The cross has been central to our theology
Right.
from day one. So when you say, I think this will become more in focus, is it because the cross, the vulnerability of the cross will become more, the vulner the vulnerability of the cross will become more focused versus the supernatural contractual act of atonement? Everybody seems to, we all in our human way vulnerably recognize sacrificial love and sacrificial
Hmm.
death.
Right.
Is that why you think it will become more focused, in a sense, the vulnerability of it versus the supernaturalism of it?
Or well, I think I know what you're saying. I might not contrast vulnerability and supernaturalism. I might contrast vulnerability and contractual ways of thinking about God's relationship to the world. And the vulnerability as a model to us, as a statement from the Christian faith of the nature of God, which William Placker, the Presbyterian theologian, years ago wrote this book, Narratives of a Vulnerable God,
Mhm.
which is an amazing book, I think. And he says it's not sovereignty that's the main attribute of God, it's vulnerability, it's love. And love is by nature a vulnerable exercise. And I
Yes.
think that has all sorts of wonderful possibilities for configuring the nature of the Christian faith. It's a dimension that I think has not been explored as much because of different models, paradigms, theological models that we've had for a very long time in the church, certainly since the Reformation. But it's not like this was invented back then either. This has been part of the church for a long time. I mean, penal substitutionary atonement may not be as old as some other ways of thinking about the atonement, but it's still fairly old. Um, so I think there's always going to be adherence to these things, but once you get to the point where I think many people are, and this is where I am, and David, it sounds like this is where you are as well, about willing to just put the cross just out there on the table and say, I don't understand what that is doing. I understand the words that Paul uses. I understand the words that Peter uses or James, but I can't existentially connect with this for the
Yeah.
following 5 reasons. Boom, 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 boom. Now, can we have a conversation? I want to be a part of this, but I have a lot of difficulty. And I think, to me, that's a very healthy place to go. But our evangelical friends listening in might say, well, you've given up. And the answer is, I have given up. Yeah, on a particular model of understanding this. It's very old. I know it's old. That pains me to say that I have some difficulty living in this present moment with conventional and tried and true models of the atonement that have come up. But yet that's where we are. And I would like to think that God values that honesty and transparency. We're not trying to destroy people's lives. We're just saying this doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah.
And the thought that just shut up and keep your head down, I don't think that's what all this Christianity business is about. Just behave yourself. I refuse to believe that.
Yeah, yeah, no, 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 no. And I think, Pete, finally, these two questions at least make me think of this. If our perspective of the Bible shifts, becomes more open, more flexible, more generous, if then what have been the essentials of Western Christianity, if that shifts, more open, more flexible, uh, does Christianity remain classically theistic? Does classical theism, and maybe I'm nerding out here, but I'm wondering if then that even upsets the personal wise man father in the sky. Now, I still hold on to psychological attachment. I
Mm-hmm.
still think we need a cataphatic experience with God. We need to walk with him, talk with him in a sense that it feels personal to us.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But if that's what God only is, then I go, well, then nothing can shift. But if it's going to shift, isn't the nature of God, the whole nature of God is shifting? No?
Yeah. No, our whole understanding of the nature of God is shifting, which shouldn't it?
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, what else do you do with this? We're done here, and that's the thing when I talk to people about science and faith issues, and how do you reconcile evolution with Christian faith, and the assumption that is very often made, even by good people, and I think very intelligent people, is that, well, here's the science part or evolution, here is the Christianity part, and they take that off the table, saying, well, we got that down. That's not going to change. Now, what do I do with this? And Dennis Lamoureux, a friend of mine who writes a lot about science and faith, he says it's sort of, the mentality is almost pinning the evolutionary tail onto the evangelical donkey. So the donkey's hanging up on the wall. It's not moving. It's there. It's permanent. Now, where are you going to stick this tail? And I think what's needed is more integration, is more synthetic thinking about what is the creation telling us about the nature of God, which of course is a huge question, but that leads us down roads that, for me at least, and I think for you as well, classical theistic categories are maybe a ramp to get to something else, that they're adequate for certain things. It's sort of like Newton's physics, it's adequate for certain things, but there are deeper things that it can't handle it. And one of those is the classic notion of the sovereignty of God, and which is brought to I think an exaggerated conclusion in Calvinism, but it's still out there. God controls everything. And the more we see about chaos in the cosmos, that is this really what is God controlling? I
Right.
keep coming back to Tom Ward, like a
Yeah,
non-controlling God, right?
I
That
agree.
just makes sense to me. And these have been conversations ever since quantum physics started rearing its head in the early part of the 20th century. We're over 100 years into it, and these kinds of questions that affect our theology are not even really talked about in many churches. It's like we're still dealing with the unimpeachable classic theistic models,
Right.
and just talk about whether there's really an up. Is God really up there and out there someplace? Is that how we talk about God? Does that even make sense?
Yeah.
Right. So that's where I am on this. And I think classical theism is a way of articulating what people have believed, and there's merit in it. Let's just say that, because we're just limited human beings, but is that the end of the story? And that's where I would rebel a little bit and say, well, how can it possibly be the end of the story?
Pete, I often think, and I'll tell our congregation that if you want to listen to the real theologians today, listen to molecular biologists and quantum physicists,
Right.
and that's where you'll hear deep,
Mm-hmm.
deep theology. But to bring this home before we end, to your point about it being helpful, then there is the person whose life derails, and then there is the person whose child ODs, or there is a, as you taught, there's a curveball in
Yeah.
life. There's something that upsets our life, and none of this nerding out theology. I shouldn't say it matters, because how we think about God certainly is going to affect how we go through these things. But then,
It's
if,
just not as obviously incontrovertibly true. You start questioning those things.
yeah,
Yeah.
or you still need to hold on to a
Yes.
personal,
All the more so, right? Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Well, I mean, I think that for me at least personally, I find a lot of solace in not thinking of God as up there looking down and making cameo appearances. I think of God as being intimately infused in everything, because all existence is grounded in this author of all existence. All being is grounded in this, the one who's the ground of all being. And that's not just gobbledygook. To me, that's very important. It's, nothing exists apart from God. And everything from the smallest subatomic particles to the big inanimate objects like black holes and galaxies and things like that, it all exists because of the one who's the ground of all existence. That gives me comfort. I can't think of God as, the man in the sky, which nobody does, but we sort of do.
That's right.
When it comes down, that's the metaphor we're used to
Yes.
using. And for me, thinking of getting used to the idea and maybe even becoming more aware of the notion that God permeates all of existence because God is existence, and yet is still, I mean, I hesitate using these words because they're so loaded with stuff, but is still personal, is still a loving presence. The spirit is loving and it is nurturing. And I'd like to think moving the cosmos in, what Pierre de Chardin says, Teilhard says, not de Chardin, but Teilhard says is the omega point where there's a telos, there's an end to all this, there's a direction where it's moving. And I that's what I can think about during the day. Like, how does all this God stuff work? And to me, that's comforting. It
Yeah.
may not be for everybody, but for me, it's like, okay, I can stop pretending that it all makes sense. I can stop pretending that all the categories of classical theism and classical notions of the atonement, that it all fits very nicely. Like that God part, we can just put away. No, that's right there. And this, it moves together with that. And you have a synthetic notion. And not to go on and on here, but that's as old as the Bible itself. When the heavens declare the glory of God, Psalm 19, it's just that the heavens were of a very different nature back then, but it caused praise and awe. And I think we're in that position very much and have been for the past 100 years or so. It's just that we're in awe, and the God that we're conceiving of looks different than what it was before that all happened.
Yeah. And Pete, not to end this kitschy, but I mean, could all of this be under the umbrella of, I mean, God is love, that all of this,
I
that
think
love,
so. Yeah.
yeah, that love is the central togetherness, belonging, being divine of the cosmos.
Yeah. And you could back that up with Bible verses too, if you
I
want
think
to, right?
so. Yeah.
And the notion of what is love and what do we mean by God and what do we mean by is, those are things that have to be discussed. But it's a, if anything happens that I hope is good, it's to reorient us toward the centrality of love and letting that be something we explore as we think theologically about the nature of God. And I've had experiences in my life where I've sort of said that to people, and some of my more conservative brothers and sisters would say, love, what's that got to do with anything? It's about the sovereignty of God. It's that old category. But you just hang in there, because I think every once in a while what we need is the love of God and not really the sovereignty of God. And if God is sovereign, then that just, this is Tom Moore, that just creates all the mess. Like,
Right.
okay, then explain why stuff happens. Mystery of God. Matt, I'm not going to buy the abduction of children or young children getting cancer or all the millions of horrible things that can happen to us. I don't think are by God's design and by God's sovereign will. I think that's an obnoxious theology that I want nothing to do with. It makes no sense to me. And I'll say that. It just makes no sense to me. I want nothing to do with it. If this is what the God of the multiverse is like, then there is no God,
Yeah.
in my opinion.
Well, Pete, thanks
How's
for,
that for a happy ending?
man, that's good. Well, we ended on love, Pete. We really did.
Okay, that's right. And me
Yeah.
being grumpy for a minute, but that's okay.
Yeah. Well, Pete, I'm a quarter of the way in Curveball, and I
Good.
read everything you write, but I think I can speak for all of us. Keep saying your thoughts, keep writing your thoughts down, because they're helping so many of us who are in our own existential, theological, religious shifts, and
Yeah.
yet who still want to carry on in this whole God is love thing,
Yeah.
and still attach our lives to Christian spirituality. So
Mhm.
thank you for all that you do.
Well, and I'm thankful for people who engage and get me thinking about stuff too.
Good. Thanks, Pete. Pete, as we've talked a lot of these things theologically, and how they affect our head, our heart. I know in my own journey, having been an evangelical megachurch pastor, in that church growth world for 30 years and then leaving that, uh, I went through a lot of, not just the theological shift created huge relational shifts
Yeah.
in friendships. Uh, it created, my wife and I did not go through this at the same time, the same way. I raised my children a certain way, and then at some point in their teenage years had to sit down with them and go, yeah, I know that's what I've said, but um, which my
Yeah.
kids were really glad about,
Yeah,
actually.
I'm sure.
My
Yeah.
kids were not like, what? They were, my son was, Dad, it's about, he actually said, Dad, it's about effing time. That's
Yeah, no.
what he actually said. And
Well, I've gotten that too. So yeah, I get it.
yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, how has this journey been for you personally, as far as friendships, relationships,
Hmm.
your mental, emotional health?
Yeah,
How,
I mean, friendships and relationships, that's maybe an easier thing to address because this has never been an issue with family, which is nice because in some cases it is, and it can really harm things. But this has not had any like effect other than I think positive, especially with my adult children, who are very different spiritually, all three of them. And so I think it was sort of a relief to them. And that gave us a chance to talk about things they heard in church when they were young that traumatized them. And so that's been good for me. Um, in terms of like friendships, I've lost communities. That's what I've lost through this, which means I've lost familiarity, but it may not have been as functional a community as I needed, So but there's always a loss. I know that, you know, it struck me many times over the past 20 years that feeling the need to leave churches, which happened a couple of times, the kids that your kids used to play with, you lose contact with them, right? And that's the hard thing. And I'm sort of like a traditional person in that respect. I believe in friendships and even neighborhoods and people going to church and doing things together, whatever, picnics. But that as people know, that gets dropped pretty quickly, and it's oftentimes very innocent because people don't know what to do with you. You think like those people we keep being warned about. So I'm not sure if we can do stuff. They'll never say that, but that's sort of what's happening behind the scenes. So there's always a cost there, and I mourn that sometimes, but I also am quickly cured of that mourning by realizing, had I stayed there, what would I have become? How miserable would I be?
yeah.
So it was sort of a sacrifice worth making. But I mean, emotionally, I overthink everything, which is part of the problem. But left to myself, um, I think that probably one of the thoughts I return to most is, what if nothing that I think is at all real? What if I'm just making stuff up in my head? And everybody can ask themselves that same question, from the most ardent atheist to the most fundamentalist Christian. but it's still an active question for me because the guardrails used to be up, and I could flirt with them and maybe push them a little more broadly and leave myself a little more room. But now the question is more, what do I even mean by guardrail, and are there any? And does the Christian faith provide certain guardrails to the faith? And that's, to me, I think about that a lot, and I don't really have answers. And when I teach college students, I more teach them the biblical story. I don't get into things that people our age will think about, and that maybe 18 and 20-year-olds won't think about. So I can easily coexist doing that and with authenticity. But yeah, it's not overwhelming, but it's like a constant background noise that, if anything, keeps me from getting lazy.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
always the pressure to be. I value authenticity. I think this is for me a topic of authenticity, of being genuine and authentic, but that always takes work. And having a very good therapist who also happens to be an Episcopal spiritual uh what's the word? I just lost my train of thought. When you go talk to people about spiritual stuff, not a mentor.
A minister, a
No,
clergy,
spiritual guide, a
life
spiritual,
coach, a
thank you, something
spiritual
like that.
director, spiritual
Thank
director.
you. It
Yeah.
only took our old brains about 5 minutes to
Yeah.
figure. Yeah,
Yeah.
spiritual director. So
Got
I
it.
mean, that helps too for
Sure.
me, because I'm talking with somebody else about this stuff and not just leaving it up in my head, because I'll turn things over and over to a point where it's like it's not really productive.
Yeah.
So that's a part of it. I mean, it was easy. Um, I just very briefly here, just a quick story, which I may tell in Curveball, I can't remember, but the my atheist phase, and I don't say that lightly. It's not like a phase, like I'm a kid. There was a period of time where nothing made sense, and I didn't know if I believed anything. And I remember the day in my bedroom, just staring out the window, and I finally said to myself, I don't know if I believe anything anymore. And this was back in 2008 or into 2009, back when I had left Westminster Seminary, where I was a teacher, because I had always wanted freedom from those restrictions. Um, I don't want people telling me what I have to believe when I just don't see it. And I remember again thinking to myself, I'm not, when those guardrails are gone, like, okay, then what's left? And I said, I don't know if I believe anything anymore. And that's when I felt something, like not a voice, but just immediately my mind or God, or however I processed that, the first thought that came to my mind was, well, Pete, you got what you asked for.
Yeah.
You don't want the guardrails, you don't have them. Now, what do you actually believe? And that's what started me really down the journey of just thinking about it. Like, what do I believe? Why do I believe it? And I'm very much in the Christian world, despite what some people might think. But I'm just not that kind of Christian the way I
Yeah.
might have been 30 years ago.
This concept of the guardrails off, and same with me, Pete. I'm still in the Christian world, so I
Right.
ask this with some vulnerability. I mean, Pete, as still holding on to our Christian spirituality, aren't we aren't we still agnostics? Aren't we also agnostics? I mean, I sometimes say about myself, I'm a Christian agnostic, not an
Yeah.
atheist, but
Right.
um,
I'm not sure.
I just don't.
How
I
do you know? I
ultimately
don't.
know, right?
Yeah, I don't know. And
Yeah,
I think that's part of being human. And the response sometimes is, well, that's why you have to get back to the Bible. And it's like, that was the beginning of my problems. And many people feel the same way. So it's not that's not the guardrail.
that's right.
I think if there is a quote guardrail, not the best metaphor here, but if there is a guardrail, I think the guardrail is God, and our in our lives of trying to become aware of the fact that God is there all around us and in us, and we just aren't paying attention. So, yeah, I'm with you. I think we're breathing the same air here. That being an agnostic Christian, I've been saying that for a long time. Rachel Held Evans said that. She's a Christian agnostic. What I think she called herself that,
Yeah.
and that's just a recognition of, I think, not wishy-washiness, but humility. That I'm putting the pieces of God and the world together, realizing that I cannot possibly reach the bottom of this.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the point might start becoming not so much understanding it all, but letting it affect how we live and how we interact with each other.
Mm. And isn't it ironic how the I don't know gives this sense of peace and comfort?
Yeah.
That's the irony,
Yeah.
right?
Which is very different than maybe when we were younger and we had to conquer the world, right? We have to know things. And, I went to seminary and then graduate school because I wanted to learn, I wanted to understand. But that's exactly where this whole, what we can call deconstructive process began in graduate school, not because I was too weak to hold to the faith, but because assumptions that I had bought into didn't make sense anymore. There were other ways of explaining X, Y, and Z that made a heck of a lot more sense to me, and I had to own that. I had to just be honest with myself. And for me, it happened in an academic setting, but it also happened in real life with family and things I talk about, and like the sin of certainty, and that other people experience too, more than I have, right? Those are the experiences we have that affect how we think about God.
Mm.
And I cannot live as a person of faith without saying that's the way it is. I think this is the way it is. And paying attention to the great iterations of the Christian tradition over the millennia, and Judaism. And then, I think also being conversant with other ways of thinking about God and other religions that are older than Christianity, that are in different parts of the world, and trying to see God in all that. I have a friend of mine who used to be a conservative Calvinist, is now older, and he wants nothing to do with it. But his big question is, how does Christianity relate to other religions in the world? And how do we, not a new question, right? It's a pretty old one, but
Sure.
that's a part of my thinking as well. I've known too many Jews who will never convert to Christianity, at least of the, let's say, evangelical or fundamentalist sense. What does God think of them?
Yeah.
Right? Because they happen to be born Jewish.
Yeah.
I happen to be born in a different context. Had I been born someplace else, I might not be anything like what I am now. My context shaped me.
Yeah.
So is
Yeah.
that what this is all about? Or does all this sort of transcend our cultural, uniquenesses and our cultural idiosyncrasies even, is the truth of it much bigger than that? And to me, that gets me back to the Bible. How many cultural idiosyncrasies do we have in the biblical stories that span 1,200 years, Hebrew Bible through New Testament? What's going on there culturally that would lead them to talk this way?
Yeah.
And that's a very different view of the Bible, getting back to what we first started talking about. But
Very much. And I'd mentioned to you earlier, literally one of my closest friends here is a Jewish rabbi, and I'm with him. I mean, I'm with them we're together quite a bit, and his wife's a rabbi and my wife's a therapist, and we're together as couples quite a bit. But when I think of what I do hold on in my Christian spirituality, everything in his spirituality, he lives. When I think of just even the great command to love, to love your God, to love your neighbor, he lives all of
right.
those things. When I think of the Beatitudes and the cornerstone of our Christian spirituality,
Mm-hmm.
he in his Judaism, he lives all of those things. So the same thing, I have left my prescribed theological eschatology that he must be, we need to wrap him up as well. It just,
Mm-hmm.
Pete,
Right.
it was exhausting having to save
Yeah.
the world.
Yeah.
When I had to save the world, that was exhausting.
Yeah, it is. And it's not a realistic way to live. And you know, the command is given to go all the nations. I mean, I understand that, but what is Matthew talking about? And is that a command for all time? Is that, you know, what does it mean to be a command? I mean, that sounds like just academic speak of trying to get out of things, but the context is always something that that's the first thing I think about. And how does this fit into the theology of Matthew? And why don't the other gospels talk like this? You know, all those sort of things come to mind. So I want to discern those things in their context and try to understand what can or should I bring along with me from this, and what sort of things maybe shouldn't I bring along with me, all in the interest not of tickling itching ears or having my cake and eating it too, but of trying to understand what does it mean to reflect Jesus in the world we live in. And that might be to be friends with a rabbi or two, right? And not try to change them, because they often wind up knowing the Bible better than you do anyway. So, you know, well, that to me, those are the big questions that filter into real, very practical notions of what does it mean to live well, to live in a satisfying way, meaning inner peace and serenity, not winning arguments, you know, having more people come to my church.
Yeah. Well, Pete, thanks so much for the hour. I really appreciate it. And the few times I'm with you, I like you. So thanks.
I appreciate that, Dave.
Yeah.
Back at you.
Yeah, man. Well, I hope we talk soon, and peace to you and your family and yours and all that you're about and doing. So
thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
See you.
Yeah. See you soon.